the story of Sleeping Beauty that you know is a lie, not a misunderstanding, not an embellishment, but a deliberate fabrication designed to hide one of the most disturbing tales ever told. You've been told it's a story about true love's kiss. A beautiful princess falls under a curse, sleeps for 100 years, and awakens when her destined prince arrives to break the spell with a kiss. It's romantic, it's magical, and it's completely false because in the earliest versions, there was no kiss, no romance, and no choice, only violation, betrayal, and horror. To see the truth, we have to go back to the very beginning, where the tale first took shape in medieval Europe. The real Sleeping Beauty begins in medieval France, somewhere between 1330 and 1344, in an anonymous courtly romance called Perceforest. Picture the scene, in the great halls of French nobility, where tapestries depicting battles between virtue and vice hang from stone walls, where knights swear oaths to abstract concepts like honour and courage, as if they were living beings. This was the world of medieval romance, where readers expected allegorical figures to walk onto the page as casually as any mortal character. In these stories, reason wasn't just an idea. She was a woman in flowing robes who could grab a knight by the shoulder and warn him of danger. Discretion appeared as a stern matron who could block doorways. And Venus, the goddess of desire, manifested as a beautiful tempter who whispered commands that overruled all moral judgment. The princess in this version is named Zelendine, and she does fall into an enchanted sleep after pricking her finger on a flax splinter. But when her knight Troilus finds her in that tower, unconscious and defenceless, the story takes a turn that would make modern audiences recoil. Two figures materialize before him, reason and discretion themselves, not as metaphors but as physical presences blocking his path. They warn him explicitly that what he's contemplating is wrong, that violating a woman without her permission, especially while she's unconscious, marks a man as the lowest kind of criminal. For medieval audiences, this wasn't subtle symbolism. These were the forces of moral order itself telling Troilus to stop. But then Venus appears, radiant and terrible, the embodiment of lust and desire. She doesn't suggest or tempt, she commands. She tells Troilus to lie with the unconscious princess, and in the moral framework of medieval romance, when a god gives a direct order, mortals obey. The audience would have understood this as both Troilus's damnation and his excuse. He violates Zelendine while she sleeps, and the princess doesn't wake from this violation. She remains in her death-like state for 9 more months, while her body carries and delivers a child she never knew she conceived. The awakening comes only when the infant, searching desperately for nourishment, begins to suckle on his mother's finger and accidentally draws out the cursed splinter. Zelendine wakes to find herself a mother, violated in her sleep, with only a ring left behind as evidence of her attacker's identity. The text tells us she mourns the non-consensual act she endured, even as she's expected to love the man who committed it. But this wasn't even the most explicit version. 300 years later, in 1634, an Italian poet named Giambattista Basile published what would become the direct ancestor of our modern tale. To understand Basile's world, you must picture the glittering, decadent courts of Naples, where nobles gathered not for pious sermons, but for entertainment that pushed every boundary. Basile himself was a courtier, soldier, and administrator who had travelled from Venice to Mantua, collecting the darkest, most grotesque tales from every corner of Italy. His Pentamerone, subtitled The Tale of Tales, was written in Neapolitan dialect, specifically for aristocrats who prided themselves on their sophistication and their ability to stomach the unseemly. These weren't bedtime stories. They were performed at banquets where wine flowed freely and nobles competed to show how unshockable they were. Basile's tales featured mutilation, incest, elimination, all wrapped in Baroque language so ornate it turned horror into art. The nobles would laugh at the crude humour, gasp at the violence, and then debate the moral implications between courses of roasted peacock and candied fruits. This was entertainment for people who watched public executions for sport and kept court dwarfs for amusement. Basile knew exactly what his audience wanted, stories that were simultaneously revolting and irresistible. He called his version Sun, Moon and Talia, and in it, a great lord learns from astrologers that his daughter Talia will be endangered by a flax splinter. He bans all flax from his kingdom, but prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves. When Talia grows into a young woman, she discovers an old woman spinning thread. Fascinated by the twirling spindle, she pricks her finger and collapses into what appears to be death. Her father, devastated, abandons the entire palace with her body still inside. Years pass. A king on a hunting expedition stumbles upon the abandoned castle. He climbs into the tower and discovers the beautiful, perfectly preserved Talia. And here, Basile doesn't hide behind metaphor or suggestion. The king, overcome with desire for the unconscious woman, takes her virginity without her consent. The original Italian is explicit. He plucks from her the fruits of love. Then he simply leaves, returning to his own kingdom as if nothing happened. Talia remains unconscious through the assault, through 9 months of pregnancy, through the agony of childbirth. She delivers twins while still in her death-like sleep. The babies, whom she never names but who become known as Sun and Moon, survive somehow beside their comatose mother. One day, one of the infants, searching for milk, begins to suck on her finger instead of her breast. The child draws out the cursed splinter, and Talia finally awakens to find herself a mother of 2 children with no memory of how they came to exist. When the king returns and finds her awake with his children, Basile tells us he's thrilled at what he had accomplished. Not ashamed, not apologetic, thrilled. Yet even Basile's grotesque version wouldn't survive untouched. The horror was too raw, too revealing, and so later storytellers reached for a mask, a single, delicate gesture that could erase centuries of violence with one manufactured moment. You have to understand what's happening here. The kiss that you know, that Disney immortalized, that parents tell their children about, it isn't just a romantic addition to the story. It's a replacement, a substitution designed to erase the original horror. In the earliest versions, the awakening is a direct biological consequence of violation. The children born from that violence are the very agents who break the curse. Later, storytellers couldn't sanitize this causal link without fundamentally breaking the story's logic, so they invented something new entirely. They created the kiss. But the assault wasn't even the darkest part of the original tale. The story doesn't end with the princess waking up. In Basile's version, the king who forced himself on Talia is married. When he returns home, he begins to mutter the names of his victims in his sleep. Talia, Sun, Moon. His wife bribes his secretary to reveal the truth, and when she learns about the other woman and the twin babies, she orchestrates a revenge so monstrous it defies comprehension. The queen orders her cook to unalive the children and serve them to the king for dinner. She wants her husband to unknowingly consume his own offspring. This isn't unique to Basile's imagination. It's a recurring nightmare that echoes through European folklore like a collective scream. Think of the Greek myth of Procne, who discovered her husband Tereus had forcibly slept with her sister Philomela and cut out her tongue to silence her. In revenge, Procne took the life of their son, Aeetes, boiled him, and served him to Tereus for dinner, only revealing what he'd eaten after he'd swallowed the last bite. Or consider the tale of Thyestes from Greek mythology, who unknowingly ate his own sons at a feast prepared by his brother Atreus. These stories of parents consuming their children appear again and again, from ancient Greece to medieval England, always as the ultimate violation of natural order, the most profound corruption of the sacred bond between parent and child. In Basile's telling, the cook, unable to bring himself to slaughter infants, hides the twins with his wife and serves the king 2 lambs instead. But the queen doesn't know about the substitution. As her husband eats what she believes are his children, she whispers under her breath, "Eat, eat, you are eating of your own." The phrase becomes a chant, a curse, a celebration of the ultimate revenge. For Basile's audience, this would have been both horrifying and familiar. They knew these myths, understood that cannibalistic revenge was the nuclear option of folklore, the point where human became monster. When Charles Perrault adapted the tale for the French court in 1697, he was operating in an entirely different world. Picture Versailles under Louis XIV, where every corridor gleamed with gold leaf and every conversation could determine your fate. This was an era of transformation and anxiety. Women were no longer content to be silent ornaments. They were hosting salons where philosophy, literature, and politics were debated with a freedom that terrified conservative men. Educated women like Madame de Sévigné and Madame de Lafayette were writing novels and letters that challenged traditional narratives. The précieuses, intellectual women who frequented these salons, were openly questioning marriage, discussing alternatives to motherhood, and claiming the right to choose their own lovers. Perrault wasn't just a storyteller, he was a cultural warrior in this battle for France's soul. A member of the Académie Française and a devoted supporter of modern literature over ancient classics, he understood that fairy tales weren't just entertainment. They were weapons of social conditioning, tools to shape young minds before dangerous ideas could take root. His Histoire ou Contes du temps passé wasn't written for children initially. It was for the adults who would read these tales to children, embedding moral lessons deep in their consciousness. Every story carried a warning, and Sleeping Beauty's warning was clear. Women who sleep too deeply, who let down their guard, who exist in passive beauty, are the ideal. Women who stay awake, who act, who choose, they're the threat. Perrault made a calculated decision. He removed the violation entirely, replacing it with the prince simply kneeling before the princess, and she awakens. The violence that drove the original plot vanished, replaced by a moment so chaste it barely qualified as contact. But remarkably, he kept the cannibalistic second half of the story, even embellishing it. In his version, the prince marries the awakened princess in secret because his mother is quite literally an ogress, with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. When the prince becomes king and goes to war, his ogress mother orders the cook to prepare her daughter-in-law and grandchildren for her dinner. The cook substitutes animals again, serving the ogress a hind instead of the young queen, a lamb and kid for the children. But when the ogress discovers the deception, she prepares a copper vat filled with vipers, toads, and venomous serpents. She intends to throw the young family into this writhing mass of poisonous creatures. The king returns just in time to witness his mother's monstrous rage, and the ogress, in her fury, throws herself into her own death trap. Perrault kept the cannibalism, kept the attempted infanticide, kept the family horror, but removed the assault. He understood that his courtly audience could stomach monsters and assassinations, but breaking the virginity of an unconscious woman without her consent had become too uncomfortable to preserve in an era where women were beginning to claim agency. Perrault's version may have tamed the tale for Versailles, but the story's transformation wasn't finished. A century later, two brothers in Germany would strip it down even further, this time not for courtly politics, but to forge an entire nation's identity. The final act of sanitization came with the Brothers Grimm in 1812. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm weren't just collecting stories, they were building a nation. Germany didn't exist as a unified country yet, just a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities with different laws, different customs, sometimes even different languages. The brothers believed that hidden in the folklore of peasants and grandmothers lay the pure German spirit, uncorrupted by French influence or modern decay. Their Kinder- und Hausmärchen, children's and household tales, was meant to be a cornerstone of German identity, proof that a distinctly German culture existed and deserved to unite into a single nation. But this nationalist project required purity. The brothers, devout Protestants, influenced by the moral strictness of their time, couldn't present violation and cannibalism as part of the German soul. Over 7 editions, they systematically cleaned their tales, removing vile content, softening violence, and adding Christian morality where none had existed before. For Sleeping Beauty, they didn't just remove the disturbing elements, they amputated the entire second half of the story. Their version, Little Briar Rose, ends where modern audiences expect it to end, with the kiss, the awakening, and the marriage. Everything that follows, the secret marriage, the cannibalistic mother-in-law, the attempted elimination of children, vanishes. The story is cut in half, and that half becomes the whole. But the dark symbolism remains encoded in even the sanitized versions, hidden in plain sight for those who know how to read it. The spindle itself carries a double meaning that would have been obvious to medieval audiences. The word spinster originally meant a woman who spun thread for a living, one of the few professions that could provide a woman with financial independence from men. When the old fairy or crone curses the princess to prick her finger on a spindle, she's not just endangering her life, She's marking her with the tool of female independence, then punishing her for even touching it. The shape of the spindle matters too. Long, pointed, penetrating. The princess pricks her finger and bleeds, then falls into a sleep that leaves her defenseless. The symbolism isn't subtle. The curse is a warning. Women who reach for independence, who grasp at autonomy, will be violated and reduced to their biological functions. They'll become mothers without their knowledge or consent, but the spindle is only the surface wound. Beneath the blood and sleep lies an older rhythm, one that echoes through myth and ritual, a cycle of death and return that long predates Sleeping Beauty herself. The 100-year sleep transforms the princess into something neither alive nor dead. She exists in a liminal space, breathing but unconscious, beautiful but unreachable. This state mirrors an ancient pattern that appears in myths across the world. Think of Persephone, daughter of the harvest goddess Demeter, picking flowers in a meadow when the earth suddenly splits open. Hades, lord of the underworld, emerges in his black chariot and drags her down into his realm. While Persephone remains trapped below, her mother's grief turns the world to winter. Nothing grows, nothing blooms. The earth itself enters a death-like sleep. Only when Persephone returns does spring arrive, but she must go back to the underworld for part of each year, creating the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Sleeping Beauty is Persephone in a tower instead of the underworld, her kingdom frozen in thorns instead of ice. The princess doesn't just sleep. She exists in a state of suspended animation that takes the entire world with her. Her castle, her servants, even the flies on the wall freeze in place, locked in an eternal moment. This isn't sleep. It's death without decay, winter without end. When she finally wakes, whether through childbirth in the original or a kiss in the sanitized version, she brings life back to the land. The names reinforce this reading. Aurora means dawn. Her children are called sun and moon, or day. She is the light returning after the longest night, spring arriving after endless winter. But unlike Persephone, who at least knew her captor, Sleeping Beauty awakens to find the violation already complete, the choice already stolen. The thorny hedge that surrounds the castle in later versions adds another layer of meaning. These aren't just obstacles. The thorns are alive, magical, sentient. They choke the life out of the unworthy and part only for the chosen one. They represent the psychological barriers we build around trauma, the protective walls that keep the vulnerable self hidden. But they also ensure that whoever enters must be fated, must be powerful enough to penetrate these defenses. The thorns don't protect the princess from violation. They simply ensure that only the right person can commit it. The systematic sanitization of Sleeping Beauty reflects something larger than just changing tastes in children's literature. Each edit, each omission, each substitution represents a culture's decision about what truths are too dangerous to tell. The violence becomes a kiss. The cannibalistic mother becomes a comic villain, then disappears entirely. The complex aftermath of trauma gets reduced to happily ever after. But the original stories understood something we've forgotten. They knew that life is brutal, that power corrupts, that victims can become perpetrators, that salvation and violence often wear the same face. These tales weren't meant to comfort children. They were meant to prepare adults for the horror and complexity of existence. The modern Sleeping Beauty offers a beautiful lie, that good and evil are clearly marked, that true love conquers all, that patience and virtue are always rewarded. The original Sleeping Beauty tells a different truth, that sometimes you wake up to find your life has been stolen from you, that the people meant to protect you are the ones who hurt you most, that survival might mean accepting the unacceptable. The story we tell our children is a deliberate forgetting, a cultural amnesia designed to protect innocence. But the dark heart of the tale remains, beating beneath layers of revision and denial. Every time we tell the sanitized version, we participate in the cover-up. We become complicit in erasing the testimony of countless women who recognize their own stories in the original tale, who understood what it meant to wake up and find that everything had changed while they slept. The fairy tale you know is exactly that, a fairy tale. The real story, the one they've been hiding for centuries, is something else entirely. It's a horror story, and the most terrifying part is that we've been telling it to children for generations, dressed up in a princess gown and sealed with a kiss.